My wife secretly recorded our arguments. Here's why. The echoes of silence. For 10 years, Mark and Sarah were the couple everyone envied. Their home was filled with light, expensive furniture, and the rhythmic sound of a life well lived. But beneath the surface, a slow rot had set in. It began with small things, a forgotten anniversary, a sharp tone over dinner, until their conversations became a minefield. Mark was a high-powered corporate lawyer, a man trained to win every argument. Sarah was a freelance illustrator, someone who felt the world in colors and shadows. When they fought, Mark used logic like a scalpel, dissecting Sarah's emotions until she felt small and irrational. One Tuesday evening, while looking for a spare charging cable in the kitchen junk drawer, Mark's fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. It was a small, sleek digital voice recorder. He frowned, thinking it was his. He pressed the play button. "I just feel like I'm disappearing, Mark," Sarah's voice echoed from the tiny speaker. "You're being dramatic again," Mark's recorded voice replied, cold and dismissive. "Check the facts before you start crying." Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't just one recording. There were dozens. Dates, times, and labels. Kitchen Tuesday, bedroom Friday, the gala night. The confrontation. The betrayal felt like a physical weight. Mark waited in the dark living room until Sarah came home. When she walked in, the glow of the street lamp hitting her face, he held up the device. "Why?" he whispered. His voice was a mix of rage and genuine hurt. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply put her keys on the table and looked at him with a weary, hollow expression. "Because I started to believe you," she said softly. "Believe what?" "That I was crazy. That I was misremembering everything. You have this way of twisting words, Mark. You'd say something cruel, and 10 minutes later, you'd swear on your life you never said it. I recorded us because I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I needed to hear the truth when you weren't there to rewrite it." Mark was stunned. In his world, recordings were for evidence, for courtrooms, for destruction. To Sarah, it was a lifeline to her own reality. The deep dive. That night, Mark didn't sleep. He sat in his study with headphones on, listening to the history of his marriage through a speaker. As he listened to hours of their arguments, he heard things he hadn't noticed in the heat of the moment. The gaslighting. He heard himself tell her she was too sensitive every time she expressed a need. The interruptions. He realized he never let her finish a sentence. The tone. His voice sounded like a stranger's, condescending, sharp, and utterly devoid of the love he claimed to feel. He heard Sarah's voice change over the months. In the early recordings, she was feisty, fighting back. In the recent ones, she sounded defeated. Her voice barely a whisper, often ending in the sound of her walking away and sobbing quietly in another room. He wasn't just a lawyer winning arguments. He was a husband losing his wife. The path to redemption or ruin. The next morning, the house was silent. The recordings had stripped away the facade. Mark realized that their marriage was at a terminal point. He had two choices. He could use his legal mind to turn the recordings against her in a divorce, claiming a breach of privacy. Or he could finally face the man he had become. He found Sarah in the garden. "I listened to them," he said. "All of them." Sarah turned, her eyes guarded. "And I hated the person I heard," Mark admitted. "I didn't recognize him. But I also know that you kept these because you didn't trust me to hear you. And I don't know if we can ever get that trust back." To be continued. The story continues with their attempt at therapy. The secret Sarah was keeping besides the recordings. And the ultimate decision they had to make about their future. The therapy of echoes. They decided to try one last thing. A specialized marriage counselor named Dr. Aries, known for dealing with high-conflict couples. But Mark insisted on a radical condition. He didn't want to just talk about their feelings. He wanted to bring the recorder into the sessions. "If the recordings are the only truth we have," Mark told Sarah, "then we have to face them together." The first session was brutal. Dr. Aries sat in silence as Mark played a clip from 3 months prior, an argument about Sarah's career. In the recording, Mark's voice was like ice. "Your little art projects don't pay the mortgage. Sarah, my time is literally worth more than yours. That's not an opinion, That's a bank statement. Hearing it played back in a neutral office, Mark felt a wave of nausea. Sarah sat with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at a spot on the floor. Mark, Dr. Ari said calmly, when you hear that man speaking, do you like him? No, Mark whispered. I sound like a bully. And Sarah, the doctor turned to her. When you were recording this, what were you feeling? I felt like I was disappearing, she said, her voice trembling. I recorded it because I knew if I told him later how much that hurt, he'd say he was just being logical, and that I was overreacting. I needed the file as a shield. The second secret. As the weeks went by, the recordings became a bridge. They stopped being weapons and started being mirrors. But there was a gap in the timeline, a 2-week period in October where there were no recordings at all. Why did you stop in October? Mark asked during a late-night talk at home. We fought plenty that month. Sarah was quiet for a long time. She walked over to her desk and pulled out a manila envelope. She didn't hand it to him. She laid it on the table between them. I didn't stop because things got better, she said. I stopped because I found out something. That made our arguments feel insignificant. And I was too afraid to tell you because I knew how you'd react. Mark opened the envelope. Inside were medical reports. Sarah had been diagnosed with an early stage neurological condition that affected her fine motor skills, the very skills she needed to draw and paint. While Mark had been busy winning arguments about chores and schedules, Sarah had been facing the potential end of her career and her passion in total isolation. I didn't record those weeks, Sarah said, tears finally falling, because I couldn't bear to hear you tell me that my health was just another inconvenience to your schedule. The breaking point. The revelation shattered Mark's remaining ego. The logical world he had built was a cage that had kept his wife trapped in her own suffering. He realized that his need to be right had made him the last person she could turn to in her darkest hour. That night, Mark did something he hadn't done in years. He didn't argue. He didn't fix. He didn't offer a legalistic solution. He simply sat on the floor at Sarah's feet and wept. He realized the recording device wasn't a betrayal of their marriage. It was a symptom of its death. She had turned to a machine for validation because her husband had become a stone. I'm so sorry, he sobbed into her lap. I'm so sorry. For the first time in a year, Sarah reached out and touched his hair. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The clean slate. They spent the next 6 months in a different kind of life. Mark stepped back from his senior partnership track, prioritizing Sarah's treatments and their time together. The digital recorder sat on the mantelpiece, no longer hidden, but no longer used. One evening, Sarah picked it up. She looked at the small, black device that had saved her sanity and nearly ended her marriage. What should we do with it? She asked. Mark looked at it. There's one more thing I want to record. He took the device, pressed record, and looked Sarah directly in the eyes. My name is Mark, and I am learning how to listen. I am learning that being right is worthless if I am alone. I love my wife, not as an opponent to be defeated, but as a person to be held. This is the only truth I want to remember. He pressed stop and handed it to her. Sarah took the device, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. Then, with a firm hand, she deleted every single file on the recorder, the screams, the gaslighting, the tears, leaving only Mark's final message. She put the recorder in a box of old electronics and pushed it into the back of the closet. They didn't need it anymore. They were finally speaking the same language. The ending. Their journey wasn't perfect. Sarah's hands still shook some days, and Mark still had to catch himself when his voice turned sharp. But the secret recordings became a legend in their own household, a dark chapter that taught them that in a marriage, if one person wins the argument, both people lose the relationship. They didn't just save their marriage. They built a new one on the ruins of the old. This concludes the story arc. Would you like me to write an alternative, darker ending? Or perhaps a prequel about their early years before the fighting began? The Ghost in the Machine. 5 years had passed. Mark and Sarah's life looked different now. They had moved out of the sterile, high-rise apartment and into a smaller house with a sprawling garden. Sarah's neurological condition had stabilized, though she now painted with broader, more abstract strokes, a style she found more liberating than her previous precision. Mark was no longer a litigator. He worked as a mediator, helping other couples and businesses find common ground without the bloodshed of a courtroom. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning out the guest bedroom for Sarah's sister's visit, Mark found a small, dust-covered box. Inside, buried under old cables and a dead cell phone, was the recorder. He held it in his palm. It felt lighter than he remembered. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to see if it still worked. He plugged it into a charger, and after a few minutes, the small screen flickered to life. There was only one file left, File 001. He pressed play. I love my wife, not as an opponent to be defeated, but as a person to be held. Mark closed his eyes. Hearing his own voice from 5 years ago was like hearing a ghost. He remembered the desperation of that night, the fear of losing her, the ultimate test. Just as Mark was about to turn the device off, Sarah walked in. She saw the recorder in his hand and froze. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, the ghosts of their past arguments rushing back into the space between them. I found it in the box, Mark said quickly, sensing her tension. I was just listening to the last message. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed. Do you ever miss it? The winning? The being right? Mark sat beside her. Every day I have to fight the urge to be that man again, especially when we disagree about the small things. It's like a muscle memory, Sarah. My brain wants to cross-examine you. I know, she whispered. I can see it in your eyes sometimes. You start to build a case against me. But I don't say the words anymore, Mark countered. No, you don't. But sometimes, Mark, I still feel like I should be recording. Not because you're mean, but because I'm afraid I'll forget how far we've come. The legacy of the recording. They realized that the recorder wasn't just a relic of a bad time. It was their North Star. It reminded them of the edge of the cliff. They had almost jumped off. Mark looked at the device and then at Sarah. We don't need to record the bad times anymore, but maybe we should record the good ones. It started as a joke, but it became a new tradition. Once a year, on the anniversary of the night Mark found the recorder, they would sit down and record a State of the Union. They would talk about their fears, their triumphs, and their love. They weren't recording for evidence anymore. They were recording for history. The final lesson, the grand finale. Years later, when Mark and Sarah were much older, their daughter, Maya, found the collection of digital files. She asked her mother why they had kept so many recordings of just talking. Sarah took her daughter's hand. Most people think love is a feeling, Maya, but your father and I learned that love is a choice in how you speak. We kept these because we wanted to. Remember the cost of silence and the power of a single honest word. The story of the wife who secretly recorded her husband didn't end in a divorce, court, or a bitter separation. It ended in a quiet house, filled with the sound of two people who had learned that the most important thing you can do with your voice is not to win, but to be heard. The end.